We're about to study page 8, some word of introduction. If you remember last session, I gave you a word of encouragement. That up to 9b, it sounds like, wow, it's technical, it's hard, but it's not. But if you still have this feeling, the minute we reach 9b, I promise you it will be much easier. Now, in the page we're going to study, page 8, it's beautiful. You just need to focus and understand, because those like David, who is a mathematician, will have a lot of fun with this. Now, for those who just walk in, I need to give a word of intro. We have 4 Yetzi'ot in Shabbat. I assume everyone remember. We have Reshut HaYachid, a private domain, Reshut Harabim, public domain, Carmelit, and Mekom Ptur. And we explain that the definition of Reshut HaYachid, of a private domain, you have to have 2 conditions, basic 2 conditions, which is, remember, 10 tfachim height and 4x4 the width. Okay. In order to have something Reshut Harabim, a public domain, so you need to have basically 2 conditions. One is the 16 amot, and you remember the idea of a 60 ribov, like 600,000 people that walk. It's like a very busy place, like highway. So that's the basic definition of Reshut Harabim. Then we speak about rabbinic definition that is called Carmelit. And what is the Carmelit? Carmelit is not Reshut HaYachid, it's not Reshut Harabim. It has the potential of many people walking, but it's not neither one of them. Example of Carmelit, we said it's a midbar, is a desert, is an ocean, is a river, or for example a sidewalk. It's called Tzider Reshut Harabim. So we put in a Carmelit astringencies, and we said we treat it as Reshut Harabim in a sense you cannot carry more than 4 amot, and we treat it also in Reshut HaYachid that you cannot do Akira and Hancha, you cannot uproot it and put it in another place like you can do inside a private location. The minute you take it out, it's considering a chiyuv. Now, so Carmelit is basically always if it's Carmelit is in a private domain, we treat it as a public domain. If it's in a public domain, we treat it as a private domain. That's basically introduction to that. Now, the next thing is, what happens if you have, listen carefully, domain within domain within domain? What does that mean? Imagine if you have a barrel, you know, a big barrel. Now, as an example, the easy example is the big barrel of wine. You know, you have in your basement and ceiling, like some people, and use it for one. Or if you take a barrel for a honey, you know, the bees get there, and you squeeze the honey from them. You say they have the holes there, right? So what happened? What?
Beehive.
Beehive.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened with those beehive? Some situations it's large. If it stay in some location, it's by itself its domain. And because it's independent domain, then the issue, if that domain was thrown or moved from one location to another, how you treat that domain. So we basically speaks about certain situation, certain circumstance that we treated in a very special way, sometimes as a public domain, sometimes as a private domain, as sometimes as a Carmelit, as a rabbinic Carmelit, or sometimes as Makom Ptur, something that it's none of all the above. So that's our discussion of today. Amar Abaye, we are 6 lines from the top of the page. זרק כוורת לרשות הרבים, גבוהה 10 ואינה רחבה שאישה חייב, רחבה שאישה פטור. Rashi explained, based on the Mishna in the Tractate Kelim, that we speak about, it looks like a beehive, but it's not a beehive per se. You have the shape like beehive. Now, in a general Shas, the definition, general Talmudic definition, when you use the word kaveret, like beehive, can be for bees or for other purposes, like large basket. So imagine that they have a large basket, looks like a beehive, but not. It's like a small building, and they have those pieces that they made. That they have the length and the width, right? But it's basically, it's not a square. It's more like triangle. That it's running around. It's like look like almost like a large egg. Okay, and the person is standing in one domain, which is basically let's say private domain, and he pushed that basket, throw it to a public domain. Now, again, let's talk about that basket. What's the side of that basket? So we said the basket is 20 tfachim high and a 6 tfachim wide. So we said if it's so in that situation is liable. Why is liable? Because the definition, remember we said the definition of Reshut HaYachid, the definition of private domain is 4 by 4 with heights of 10 tfachim. So again and again and again, Reshut HaYachid, it's not necessarily only something that one person owns a piece of land. Reshut HaYachid, for our halachic definition, can be any entity, can be something that belongs to a city, can be something that it's just have the size, the shape, that can be in any location, can be private or public location, but the point is that domain is a separate domain. So for our understanding, it's standing in a public domain, and now they have, for example, about 40 centimeters in a size, and we treated that entity as Reshut HaYachid for Shabbat. It's like a separate entity. So again, if you're going in a street and you see like a big sculpture or big whatever it is in a public domain, and they have this measurement, this size, we treat it differently than a place that people walk. Because if you remember the previous pages, when people walk through the public domain and they have issues of walking conveniently, for example, they need to circumvent between lines, etc., those areas we don't treat it as a regular public domain. Is that clear? Now, what's the definition of public domain? Public domain, if they have the wide of 16 amah, which is what, Dave, you're a mathematician.
16 amot is 24 feet.
Thank you. 24 feet. And the next condition, that's the first. The next condition is 600,000 people basically going there, again, by the very basic definition. And the third we just learned recently is the idea that it's convenience for people to walk by. It's not a certain area that people usually don't walk because it's not convenience. If you see many pillars in a public domain running around, you go around that place. You don't go in between those locations, right? So that's, now, if you have any items that it's above 3 tfachim, this item, it belongs to a public, but you don't treat it as a Reshut HaYachid, you don't treat it as a Reshut HaRabim, private or public domain, you treat it as a new rabbinic definition that it's called Carmelit. So, when a person transfers from a private domain to a public domain, you remember we said the Torah tells us, Vayaviru kol b'machaneh. At the time the Jewish people dwelled in a desert, it was a tabernacle. It was a contribution that people brought from the tent to the house of the house of worship, the tabernacle. So it was a special announcement that people should not carry from the private domain to public domain. So we derive from that that's called melechet hotzaah, the prohibition of carrying. Because we explained that in the Reshut HaYachid, in the private domain, you have akira, which is uprooted, and then you have hancha, putting and landing it in a public domain. That's called melechet hotzaah. So Rashi here explains, I just give you the abbreviation of what's this whole sugya, so you go around in easy ways. So Rashi explained that on Shabbat, when you uprooted an item, it's called chefetz. You're taking an item on Shabbat, and you transfer it is a problem. However, and listen carefully, domain is no prohibition. In other words, if you talk about domain, moving domain, and one domain from another domain, that's different. Why? Because remember, the roots of all of that is the tabernacle's work, melechet hamishkan. It was a certain type of work that they use for the tabernacle, 39 type of work that used for the tabernacle, and it's important. That's called melechet Shabbat, some type of work that they used to do it. Otherwise, it's not considered a melacha. Here is an example. If you have in a tabernacle those tailors that they sew pieces and they put it together, okay? So it's called melechet tofer. You are just basically sewing. So that's forbidden on Shabbat. Now, in those days, you have group of people that one do his part and then he's transferring to another one who does the other thread to put around, and that's a problem. Rashi explained that they move. Now, in order for some domain to call domain, for example, for our discussion, if you have this basket, large basket, you need to have the heights of 10, right? He needs to have the width of 4 by 4, and then he transfer it from private to public. Then you didn't violate the melacha of hotzaa. Why? Because it's called in Hebrew reshut, a domain, and it's not called a chefetz. I am not a good painter, but I try to paint it right before we start this class, based on several sources. So you see, I'm speaking now in this type of a diagram. So what happened in this diagram? You have the size, you have the width, and now you see what's involved. The minute you transfer these items, then it's basically ha'avarat reshut. You transfer this domain from one location to another. So, as a side note, Rabbi Akiva said here on this Rashi, that Rashi in the Tzadik Vav in 96 said that he brought an example of sewing, like doing this type of putting together. But he said that that was not one of the 39 type of work, and they here in a side note, the Tosfot Yeshanim said that why Rashi used this example of machat, of using this sewing. For example, when it was the altar, the mizbeach and the shulchan, it's also some type of work. Why Rashi not mentioned that, but he left it as a question. So in general, anything that it's considering an chefetz, an item, it's considering an hotzaa. So something that have a domain, it's not considering an hotzaa. So now to our subject. Amar Abaye zarak kaviret, if one standing in a private domain and he took a basket and he threw it, that this basket have the length of 10 tfachim and the width is less than 6, okay? So basically what happened here, he said if it's if the basket is a 10 tfachim high but not 6 tfachim wide, he's liable. If it's 6 tfachim wide, he is exempt. Why? Because he's not transferring any chefetz, any article, but he transferring what? Domain. So again, some word of explanation. They said here that this kaveret, this basket, is around, right? It looks like an egg, or it's around. So how it is? you have a square. So basically, square in our definition is 40 by 40 centimeter, which is
about 40 by 40 would be about 16 inches by 16 inches.
60 by 16 inches. Now, you take this and you use this diagonal, this part, the diagram to understand that when it's come to this, and you have the 4 and 5 by 6, so you have this square, it's 4 tfachim, alright? And you have this part, which is 1.4 if you compare it to that part, so it's 4, so it's altogether 4 by 1.4, it's 5.6. So this is that point. So if you take all of that and you use this part and you measure it, it's basically 5 by 35. So if it takes this part and it throw it from private domain to public domain that have the length of 10 and the width is below than 6, so we called it melechet hotzaa, because what you're doing basically, since the diagonal of a square is 1.4 times the length of its sides, so the diagonal of a square 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim is 5.6. So if you throw it this type, you basically move a domain, you move a reshut. The minute you move a reshut, so domain, it's not an issue of Hotzaat Shabbat. It's not considering one of the prohibitions. Now, Rava responds, and he disagreed with Abaye, and he said, Rava Amar afilu ena rechava shisha patur. He said, even that it's not in a size of 6, so it's not a private domain, but if they have the heights of 10 tfachim, so someone who throw it from private domain to public domain, he is the thrower is exempt. My tama, what is the reason? He said, אי אפשר לקרומיות של קנה שלא יעלו למעלה מ10. He says that it can be when you basically throwing that basket it's made in such a way that they have all those small pieces that coming out. It's not really a finished product. It's things that sticks around from all over. So he said those small pieces, it's impossible that some silvers of the reed not extend above 10 tfachim. So if that happen, so part of the basket, it's exempt. So because the whole kli, the whole reshut, the whole of that, it's not exactly 10. So he said, therefore, you cannot treat it that way. So just to understand this, here is a very big machloket. To understand the whole concept is a machloket between Rashi and Rabbeinu Hananel. One hold that the koter, which means this part, right? It's basically 4 by 4, but it's the other one is 5 by 6. Tosfot said that without this part, without this dofen, it's basically 5.35 inside, which is 1/5. So it's altogether 2 by 5, and therefore he said that when you use the terminology of 6, it's not necessarily 6, it's sometimes below than 6. So why it's the issue? So they said when you move domain from another domain, so you don't transferring, like we said earlier, between private domain to public domain, you are not transferring domain. And how you define domain, we said in those measurements. So the minutes that this vessel, Rava responds, and he said it's not exactly 10, so you are not in that status. I want to elaborate on that with your permission. I just want to finish this line, and I explain it because I look at your faces and I'm not so sure if we are at the same page. So let me finish the line and explain it a little further. He said here, כפאה על פיה שבעה ומשהו חייב, שירה ומחצה פטור. There is a concept that it's called הלכה למשה מסיני. הלכה למשה מסיני meaning there is a lot of things that we believe in a traditional Judaism that God transmitted to Moshe Rabbeinu orally. For example, God said that we shall build a sukkah, but we don't know what's the size of the sukkah, what's the length. So if, for example, you have a dofen akuma, if you have one of the walls, it's not straight, you learn it by Halacha Moshe Misinai, that it's not exceeded more than asarat tfachim, more than 20 amah, below than asarat tfachim, etc. It's all Halachot Moshe Misinai. One of Halachot Moshe Misinai that we learn, it's called lavud. We learned it a few days ago. What is lavud? Anything that below than 3 tfachim from the ground, it's considered by halacha as a karka, as part of the ground. So if, for example, you have this type of mechitza, this type of separation, that it's close to the ground, but it's below than 3, we treat it as a 3. We treat it as a ground. So, for example, in our case, if you have some vessels that it's a, we explain that if you measure all together is 7.5, and you have half a tefach that it's above than public domain, so we consider that as something that is nachal karka, that's something that is stay on the ground. So because it's close to 3 tfachim to the karka, so we treat it as lavud. Lavud is like the same as it's on the ground. So if you take this and you transfer it from one location to another, it's considering as something that is domain to domain, so you are exempt. So that's the statement. It's much simpler than you think. Abaye explained, Zarak kaveret, if someone throw that domain, so he said he's exempt. Rava came and he said that you have to know that if, yes, Abaye hold that the only time you are liable it's if you have 6 by 10, okay? But Rava said that it never been an hancha in the public domain. It's never been lending in the public domain. Why? Because it's considering as a lavud. So it's basically you take something. Use here the term kepe'a al pia. It's like you take something and you throw it upside down. You take a rim, you take a basket and its rim, and you throw it in the public domain and it's face down, the opposite way. So he said what happened? It depends on the size. If it's a 7 point something, then you're liable. But if it's a 7.5 tfachim, so he is not liable. Why? Because the top of the basket is, if you come from the rest of the 10 tfachim, that's basically the foundation of lavud. Because if you have this type of mechitza, so then the whole lavud is changed. By the way, Tosfot said here that if they have the 6, it's considering already as a separate domain. But it's just to understand the sugya, to know what's all about. So Rav Ashi come to the picture and he said, if a person turn around, he took this basket and opposite way, right? They have 7.5 tfachim high and afilu shiva v'mechza chayav, even 7.5 he is liable. Why? Mai tama, what's the reason? He said mechitzot letochan asuyot, because inside that basket, so it can be, for example, if you use it for the bee, so you have those spa or other that you turn around for purpose. So those mechitzot, you don't considering it as a lavud, because this it's not resting until you reach the ground, and then when you have that, it's below than 10 tfachim. And he said that's basically negating the application of lavud, and that's not considering halacha Moshe Misinai.
You know, in all these cases when they're saying that they're patur, we're talking just Doraita, not rabbinically they're still...
No, there are some cases that rabbinically is also mekom patur. We explained many times, if it's in a definition, for example, if we treat something as Reshut HaYachid, so that's including the airspace above Reshut HaYachid, and if you treat it as the airspace above Reshut HaYachid, so it makes no difference. If it's Reshut HaRabim and it is exceeded, so depend if it's a Carmelit or Reshut HaRabim. Sometimes Reshut HaRabim, if it's exceeded more than 10 Tfachim, is no longer any treatment of Reshut HaRabim or Carmelit, is Mekom Ptur. So if it's Mekom Ptur, is exempt even by the rabbinics.
Even rabbinically, okay.
Yes, because the rabbinics, the whole idea of rabbinic involved in Carmelit, the whole idea of invention within Reshut Rabim, a new domain that have the chumrot in both Reshut Yachid and Reshut Rabim, apply to Carmelit. But sometimes it's Mekom Ptur. Here, for example, it's a big question. If you don't tell me that it's Halacha Moshe Misinai, and if you tell me that basically that kaveret, that basket, it's considering a separate domain, and it's not part of the Melechet Hotzah, and it's not part of the 39 Melachot, that forbidden. So therefore, you don't have that domain at all, so it's basically allowed by everyone. Now, Amar Ula, Amud Tish'a Birshut Harabim. Now you see the rest of the sugya will be, I hope, much simple, because you get the principle, hopefully. Amar Ula, Amud, if it's a pillar, a post, that have 9 tfachim high, and it's a Reshut in public domain. So what happened now? V'rabim mechatfim alav, and people just put the burden on it, putting the stuff on that big pillar. V'zarak v'nach al gabav, and he throw the object from 4 amot, and that object rests on that pillar, on that post, he is liable. מה טעמה? פחות משלושה מדרס דרס אל הרבים, משלושה ועד 9, לא מדרס דרס אלה ולא כתוב ומקטפי. Okay, so first and foremost, we need to again reassure that we are the same page when it's come to Reshut HaRabim. Reshut HaRabim, we said that you have to have 3 conditions. You remember? One of them is Noach LaRabim, that people use it. It's used for public needs. Here is a situation that if it's below than 3, people don't use it as a path. You know, it's inconvenience. So what happened? You have basically 4 different domains within the domain of Reshut HaRabim. Because within the Reshut HaRabim there is a lot of things that belongs to public but don't use for public, especially not for moving or walking around from one location to another. So he said, Tish'a Vadai mikatfi alavei. If it's a 9 tfachim high, the public use it to adjust the burdens, to put things upon it, right? So in other words, if it's below than 4x4, it's already considering Makom Ptur. Above 4x4, it's considering Carmelit. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef, Guma mai. What do you have if you have the ground and you go below the ground? If it's below the ground, you have a hole of 9 tfachim. So do you treat it as a public domain? Right? Why? Because sometimes people use it. Amar le v'chen beguma. He said yes, the same status have if people use it, you can use it for that purpose. Why? What? It's many examples. Someone, for example, think nowadays you have subways, or you have a lot of things that people use for underground. Depend how you build it and what you do with them. But certain section in the public domain, when you dig a law of a hole that goes down 9 tfachim, so you treat it as a public domain, as long as public using it for public and it's convenient for the public to use it, and have the size. Rava Omar, so Rava responded. He said, "Beguma lo." I disagree. He said, if you have a pit that they have the 9 tfachim in a public domain, it's not considering a public domain. Mai tama. So he said, "Tashmish al de'at chak lo shmei tashmish." So it's something that people use, and they basically it's very inconvenient for people to use. So even they use it sometimes a little bit. That's what Rashi explained to us, right? So he said, you don't treat it as a public domain, right? Because people don't use it for that purpose. So how you treat it if it's not a public domain? You treat it as
Carmelit.
Excellent. You treat it as a Carmelit that they have 4x4, and someone will throw 4 amot in the public domain, and it's landed in that pit. So basically, if it's 9, he is exempt, he's patur. So the Gemara asks a question, Eitive. Eitive is always a question, something that we want to challenge. So he said, Eitive Rava Adabarat Matna LeRava, Hayta Kupato Munachat Birshut Harabim. If he has a box lying in a public domain, Gvoha Asara, Urechava Arba'a, it will have the 10 tfachim high and 4 tfachim wide, אין מטלטלים מתוכה, לא מתוכה לרשות הרבים, לא רשות מתוכה, פחות מכן מטלטלים וכן בגומה. Why? Because it's מלאכת הוצאה. So he said, if they have this size, so you don't carry something within it to public, and not from public to that, and below you can do it. The same apply to a pit. Soon you explain. So he said, my love, a seifa. Remember earlier we said וכן בגומה. So that's the statement applied to what we said earlier, the last statement, which is that the same way as the box, that it has a 10 tfachim deep, so even that it's inconvenience for use, we carried, said lo areisha. It's referred to the first one in the Braita that said that that they have 10 tfachim deep and 4 tfachim wide in a private domain. So he said, Eitivei. So he asked a question. Eitivei, נתכוון לשבות ברשות הרבים והניח עירובו בבור למעלה מ10 טפחים, עירובו עירוב, למטה מ10 טפחים, אין עירובו עירוב. רש"י, המערב עירובי תחומים, עירובו קונה לו שביתתו שם, שיוכל ללכת משם לכל רוח 2,000 כאילו שבת שם. Introduction. On Shabbat, the Torah tells us in the book of Shmot, Al Yeitzei Ish במקומו ביום השביעי. So we learn from Shabbat the idea that if you are behind Dalet Amot, you are talking about 2,000 Amot to each ruach, to each domain. That's the maximum you can go outside of your place of dwelling. So if a person wants to go to exceed it more than 2,000 amah, what do you have to do? You have to make shvita, you have to make that spot as makom of dwelling. So in other words, we tell him, look, you can take the food, you put it there, and then if you eat in that spot, which is the end of the 2,000 tamah, you can go ahead another 2,000 tamah. Why? Because it's considering by halacha, it's called zemekom shvitato. The person that dwell, it's lefi mezonotav, the place that he eats. A person that sit and eat, we're considering that place as a place of dwelling. So when the Torah said a person shall not move from his location, we talk from a place that he is eating. So if you have someone who intend to have a shvita to establish his Shabbat residence in a certain place in a public domain, and what did he do? It was a pit in a public domain, and he put the eruv, the food that he intend to eat, in that pit. That pit has a definition of what? Reshut hayachid, as a private domain. Lemala ma'asara tfachim, if the eruv is above the 10 tfachim, eruv or eruv, so it's valid. Lemata ma'asara tfachim, if it's below, the eruv or eruv, the eruv is not valid. So obviously the Gemara wants to discuss that. So they said, Hechidami, ilema bebo ve'id be'asara. If you tell me that that's apply to a pit that they have 10 tfachim or more, ulemala. And when you use the word above the 10 tfachim, it means the delay ve'otvei, that he took the eruv and he lifted it up and he put it in the pit that it's above the 10 tfachim from the surface. So it's a eruv. Ulemata. But if it's below than 10 tfachim, the tatai ve'otvei, that he took the eruv and he put it in the pit below than 10 tfachim from the surface. So the Eruv is not an Eruv. You cannot say that. Why? Mali lemala or mali lemata. What's the difference if we put the Eruv above the 10 tfachim or below the 10 tfachim? What's the difference? He said, because either one of these situation, hu b'makom echad v'ruvu b'makom acheru, right? Because he is in a situation that someone who's dwelling in one place and the Eruv is in another place, and therefore the din is that this Eruv is not considering an Eruv. Here, if someone who dwell in a place that he wants to take a shvita, that he want to dwell permanently in a public domain, and his Eruv is in a different location, which means that it's inside this pit, that it's considering as a private domain, so he cannot remove the Eruv that it's in that pit above the 10 tfachim, because his is basically in the Reshut HaYachid in a private domain, because the entire pit from the very bottom up to the surface line, it's considering a Reshut HaYachid a private domain, and therefore the Eruv, it's not considering an Eruv. El alav, but you have to say bebordele be'asara, that we are speaking about the pit that does not have the 10 tfachim in it, which means that it's not 10 tfachim deep. Vekatane, and we learn in the Braita, Eruv or Eruv, that his Eruv, it's good. Why? Because he can pick it up from the pit and eat it in a public domain. So you have to say that this Braita is dealing with a bore, with a pit that it's considering a Reshut Rabim, a private domain, and it cannot be. Why? Because the pit that is in a public domain, considering a public domain, is when it's a 9 tfachim in a public domain. Alma. So what we learn from that? That a pit that have the 9 tfachim deep in a public domain, it's considering part of the public domain, even at its inconvenience for use. Why? Tashmish al de'akach shmei tashmish. That's a strong question. Because what we said earlier, what is the condition for the public domain? We said one of the conditions has to be, beside of the size, it has to be what? Convenience for people to use. And here, you thought that it's basically not Reshut Rabim, but he said that even at his inconvenience, we're still considering that as a Reshut Rabim, as a public domain. So how comes it's contradicted to what we said earlier? Remember, earlier we said that there are 3 conditions. One is the length, width, and the convenience. And here is the inconvenience, yet it's still considering a public domain. So he said, Zimnin meshanela, hu ve'eruvo bekarmelit. So he said, the idea is that he is in the intended Shabbat residence, both staying in Karmelit, which means, for example, if you have bik'ah or pit, right? Why you call it a public domain? Because it's not considering a private domain. Why? That here the Braita wants to teach us that only someone who wants to make a shvita, he dwell in a place that it's not private domain, like Karmelit. So it's different between pit that they have 10 tfachim and something that below. But if he wants to make shvitat Shabbat, to dwell in a place that it's a private domain, like for example in a courtyard, so it's no difference between less than 10 and more than 10, because any pit that it's in a private domain, it's considered a private domain. So even that the Eruv in that pit, it's 10 fachim deep inside the courtyard, it's still considering an Eruv. Vezimnin meshanela. And sometimes Rabbah answered this question as follow: who, meaning the place that he stopped, the space that he dwelled. Remember we said that 2,000 plus 2,000 is a place that he dwelled. So that place that he dwelled, Birshut Harabim, it's in a public domain. Ve'iruvo, but his Eruv, here's the setup of the food, Becharmelit, which means that it's inside a pit that have a 10 below than 10 tfachim, so therefore it's 9 tfachim, and we treat it as a karmelit. Verabihi, and you cannot ask for the rabbi that he has said that you cannot carry from Carmelit to public domain, because this Braita is going by the Rabbi, the Amar, that he said, כל דבר שהוא משום שבות לא גזרו עליו בין השמשות. Remember that when it's come to Carmelit, we say the Carmelit is what? Is rabbinic. So since the Carmelit is rabbinic, so we said, when you konesh vita, when you dwell, it's ben hashmashot, which means ben hashmashot is a twilight. It's not Shabbat and it's not Friday, it's in between. So basically the question is, you cannot eat at that time in a pit. Why? Because it's indefinite time. Zman lo mugdar. It's indefinite time. So you treat it as is this domain as a Carmelit, because again, the whole idea of Carmelit is rabbinic, and rabbinic hold that it's only taking Shabbat from its dark, mishechashicha. So now it's ben hashmashot in twilight. How you treat it? Mekom ptur. So if it's mekom ptur and ikana shvita, so you can do everything. It's not decree at that time. Velo teima, and you cannot say dachu yekam medachin alach. That sometimes al yedei adchak, that if you have to do it, it's considering a some type of use. Why? Ela davka kamin alach. That I want to know that you have to explain it in that way. Why? Because we said later in the Mishnah in page 100b, they said itnan im haya rekak mayim mrשות הרבים הלכת הזורק לתוכה 400 חייב. So if, again, some word of introduction, there is a weather conditions. People live in a desert. How they walk in those days, in the Talmudic time. So some people have a sandals, some people go barefoot. But if it's very hot weather, so people are always looking for a spot so they can cool off their feet, right? So if it's a shallow pool of water, right? And the public domain does through it. הזורק לתוכה 400 חייב. If someone throw an object in distance 400, so he's liable. Why? Because it's basically from public domain. It's part of public domain. And public domain, what we said, in public domain you cannot exceed it more than 400. בישלמה רקק תרי זמני. Why? Now we understand why the Mishnah use this I skip something. וכמה הוא רקק מים. So how much is the shallow pool of water that we speak? So he said פחות מ10 טפחים, below than 10 טפחים. הוא רקק מים שרשות הרבים הלכת בו, אז זורק לתוכו 400 חייב. And if you have a shallow pool of water that the public domain goes, so if someone throw an object, 400 is liable. So now what's happening here? So use the word rekak twice. So he said bishlama rekak trei zimnei. You use this term, you understand why the Mishnah used the shallow pool twice. Why? Because this shallow, it's considering a public domain, and we need it, it's necessary. Why? As we said, people who are barefoot, or people who have, it's a very hot weather, in Talmudic time, so they need to rush to these shallows to cool off. So if it's the summertime, we understand. But if it's in the winter time, so you not say that the pool is not a public domain, because why? People don't go there. ויש מרימות המשמים, אגב דמנתף מקרא ונחת, אבל מאוד החמה לא צריכה. So what happened is in the winter time, so sometimes the feet get dirty. So you use this shallow for the purpose of cleaning, right? So it happens that they step down to the pool as well. But in the summertime not, so it's necessary. So both is considering רשות הרבים. אלא הילוך תרי זמני למה לי? So why you use the word going twice, right? They use רקק מים שרשות הרבים הלכת בו, that the public domain walk through. So it's enough to say it once. Elalav shmamina hiluch. That we learn from that if it's a walk by many, al yedei adchak shemeiluch. If it's no other inconvenience passage, so it's considering a passage. Tashmid yedei adchak lo shmei tashmi shmamina. So if it's al yedei adchak, if it's not considered proper usage, so it's not considering a tashmish. Now, in general, you should know that if it's repeat the word shmamina twice, it means that's the final halacha. Amar Rav Yehuda Heizer Zade Kane Rema v'zakfe lo mechayev de'akarle. Now, the Gemara dealing deep down with the halachot of Akira and Hancha, uprooted and loading in different locations. So Rav Yehuda said, Rashi said here that it's some piece of dirt that you take from the ground and you put this bundle of reeds. So he said if one throw it down and stand up, which means he lift up the bundle, he throw down the ground, and again, lo mechayev de'akara, it's not liable until he lift both ends of the bundle from the ground and put it to the Arba Amod. Amar Adam omed ala iskopa. Now we go back to the whole four Rashayut that we discussed on page 6, and he said, remember that we said that someone is in iskopa, it's the miftan, it's the entrance. You remember we talked about water coming in and out of the house. So Adam omed ala iskopa, a person standing at the threshold of the house, notel mi ba'al habayit, he's taking from the hand of the homeowner who is standing in a private domain, venoten lo, and he give it to him. Noten me'ani, the same way he take object from a poor man standing in a public domain, venoten lo, and he give it to him. Why? He said, hai iskopa, this type of threshold. Mai, what's the halacha? Ileima iskupat reshut harabim. For example, if you remember, we talk about mavoi. House, you have this mavoi in between that belongs to public. Let me use an example. You remember that piece, you have it over there? Can you hand it over to me? On that one, the piece of yes.
Paper?
Yes, thank you. So you have the picture. Yes, give it to me, the first one. Thank you, the first one. Thank you. So this one is the mavoi. Now you have this iskupa standing here, so it's belong. If you don't have this lechi, it belong to a public. So if someone take this iskupa, right? He take this threshold. Not tell me ba'al habayit, the person is standing in the threshold and take the object from the householder. He's basically transferring item. It's forbidden. But you have to say that it's in a private domain, like for example, homeowner at the front of his house and he's standing in that threshold. Not tell me naani. The same problem. Is basically transferring from the public to the private. Ella iskupat karmelit. That's then complicated because this, you talk about the threshold that is passing in the status of karmelit. So notel venotel lechatchila. Sof isua miya itya. Even you tell me that it's a different situation because the karmelit has a different status, but it's still he violating something. So again, karmelit is like rabbinic prohibition. You treat it differently, but by the same token, you can't say that he does nothing. By carrying from one domain to another, it's not like transferring reshut to reshut to reshut. It's iskupa that is part of the karmelit. אלא איסקופה מקור פטור בעלמא הוא, you have to say that this threshold is exempt area when כגון דלית בארבעה על ארבעה. When this is not possess a dimension 4 by 4 טפחים, which means if you have a place that is מקום פטור, when is מקום פטור? One of the condition is 4 by 4 טפחים. So if it is only 3 טפחים, so you basically can transfer from private domain to public domain to that location. וכי דחייתה רב דימי אמר רבי יוחנן. Remember when we said that Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylon, so he said on the name of his teacher Rabbi Yochanan, makom she'en bo arba'a al arba'a tfachim, that it's located between a public domain to private domain. Mutar lebnei reshut hayachid ולבני רשות הרבים לחטף עליו. The people can put their thing that they carry on the shoulder, put it there. ובלבד שלא יחליפו, which means the person should not stand in a place that is מקום פטור and lifted some item from one location and transfer it to another. אמר מר ובלבד שלא ייטול. So they elaborate and they said it's in condition that someone standing in the threshold, he doesn't take an item מבעל הבית from the homeowner that he is standing in a private domain, ונותן לעני, and is given to a poor person who's standing in a public domain, מעני, someone who is in a public domain, ונותן לבעל הבית, and he give it to the homeowner who is in a private domain, ואם נטל ונתן שלושתם פטורים. So if they did it, they're all free from sin offering. Why? Because they didn't violate Torah law. So what we learn from that? So if someone transfer an item from one domain to another, while he's standing in a place that it's a mekom ptur, so he is exempt from the sin offering. So they said, Leima tehevet yuvta de Rava. So this will be a challenge to what the Rava said. Amar Rava, המעביר חפץ מתחילת ארבע לסוף ארבע ברשות הרבים. Rava said that if one carries an object in the public domain from the beginning of the 4 amot to the end of the 4 amot, אף על פי שהעבירו דרך עליו, because he has lifted that item above his head and he hold it on the top of עשרה טפחים in the airspace of a public domain, that is basically considering a makom ptur, so chayav, so he is liable. So the teirutz, the answer is hatam, that this what Rava said, lo nach hachanach. Here this item, it didn't landed in mekom ptur between akira and hancha, which means that he's uprooted an item from a public domain and he put it in a private domain at the end of Arba Amot without putting it between the two. So therefore he is obligated. Hacha, but here when this item landed in the mekom ptur, which means when he transferred this item in his hand from a place that is mekom ptur, that he is standing, so that item, it's considering like it didn't land there. So therefore, uprooting that item from one place and putting in other places is exempt, but because it's mekom ptur, and one who transfer it is like transferring in a place that is mekom ptur. Practical halachot Shulchan Aruch 345, he said, Zarak kaveret l'rshut harabim. If one throw a barrel, a large one, a round barrel, into a public domain, any vessel that has an area of 4 by 4 handbreadth and 10 handbreadth highs, which means the measurement of a private domain, and is placed in a private domain, is considered a private domain. For example, a cabinet, a dresser, or barrel. As a result, if the vessel was thrown from the private domain to a public domain, the thrower is exempt. Since its legal status is like the of a private domain, halachically the object was actually thrown from a private domain and remained in a private domain. Another thing is, if the barrel, but any object thrown in the public domain whose upper edge it's above 10 tfachim, above 10 handbreadths. As long as the length and the width are 4 by 4 handbreadths, for a height and of 10 breadth is considered to be its own domain. Consequently, one who throw it is exempt the way that Rava said. Now, another important halacha, it's a guma. If you have a hole, so the Shulchan Aruch said is a pit in a public domain that is less than 3 handbreadths, small one. Deep is part of the public domain. A hole between 3 and 9 handbreadths deep in an area of 4 by 4 handbreadths is considering a Carmelite. If it is not 4 by 4 handbreadths, it's exempt domain. It is if it is a 10 or more handbreadth deep and 4 by 4 handbreadth is a private domain. So in that case as well, if it's less than 4 by 4 is exempt domain, and it's like Mekom Ptur, is the way that Rava explained to us. The last halacha of today, it's Hu ברשות הרבים ועירובו בכרמלית. If he was in a public domain and his Eruv was in a Carmelite, if one place in Eruv in a Carmelite and he was in a different domain, it is an effective Eruv. As at the time that when the Eruv took effect on Shabbat Eve at twilight, he was permitted to take it. That's the way that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Because we said כל דבר שהוא משום שבות לא גזרו עליו בין השמשות. Anything that they do to a rabbinic decree, they did not issue a decree during the twilight. The sages did not issue a decree during the twilight, especially in the cases of a mitzvah, right, or some special circumstances. So, for example, if someone have the rekak mayim, the swamp shallower, that they have the 10 tfachim, and that passes in the public domain through its multitudes walk, is part of the public domain, so it's considering a Carmelite. So if someone need to stop by that location for all kind of reasons, dependent time, but if it's Ben Hashmashot, so the Rabbanan did not put any decree in that location.